Good afternoon. I hope you're all doing well today. Today I want to talk about communicating closeness, how couples develop and maintain intimacy in their relationships. I want to talk a little bit about the end of the last class, but the first thing I want to talk about is how to study for your exam. As you may have noticed, if you've cracked open the reader yet, as I hope you have, by the way, thanks for coming today. I know you have a lot of educational options, and I appreciate your sharing your Friday afternoon here with me. I really do. But I do want to tell you a little bit about the exam. The exams, I'm not writing your exam, which based on the evaluation students have written for me in the past is a really good thing for you. Professor Carney and Lisa, your TA, who's not here today, will be writing the exam questions. But let me give you some tips on how to study for a class like this. I assume you will have something on the order of 50 multiple choice questions, and I imagine that they will have probably 5 response options each, right? So the task that you have in thinking about the exam, I think the biggest task is how do you scrunch down all of that information that we're trying to provide you so that you can feel competent and capable and really prepared as you go into the exam. These are just my suggestions, having taught a class like this now for this specific class for 6 years or so, and a lot of classes like this for 20 years. I would say, and Seema has already heard this because she came to my office hours today, I would say use the lectures as a good starting point. Because what we do is we try to, when we prepare a lecture, we say, okay, what's important? How can I use the structure of the book, the reader, as a starting point, and then elaborate on that and enrich that and sort of send out the best possible, most interesting message, okay? So when we give a lecture, we are in effect saying, let me tell you what's most important, okay? So start with the lectures. The lectures matter a lot, and we are really saying this is the filters that we use. When we either wrote that chapter or read that chapter in advance of preparing a lecture, we sort of had to make some decisions about what really matters, okay? Now, if we attend to a study in class, there's a good chance that we think that's important, right? Because I spent time on the Kelly and Conley study, well, that's a classic study. When you study personality over 50 years, that kind of matters, right? So start with the chapter, focus on the material. Once you see that, go into the chapter, and focus on the ideas that embellish what you heard about in class, all right? Don't worry too much about an individual study that just gets brief mention, okay? Try to look, but if we spend a lot of time talking about a study in the reader, and there's a figure there, that means it's important. We have in effect said, you know, this is kind of important. Pay attention to this. And our goal when we write an exam is to test you on what we think is important, right? Not on the trivial things. We want you to be aware of the details, but focus on the big picture items, okay? So that's a good starting point. A couple other ideas that I think will be really helpful for you as you get going. First, think about studying with somebody else. It's not just because this is a class on relationships, but because when you study with somebody else, and maybe it wouldn't be a crazy thing to say, let's divide up the chapters. You teach me this stuff. I've read it, but you teach me this stuff, and I'll teach you that stuff. Right? You get 2 or 3 of you together, and that makes the process more efficient, for one thing, but it also forces you to think about the material in different ways. Okay? We know from a lot of cognitive psychology that any time you can be an active learner instead of a passive learner, right? Anytime you can think about the material in a new way, a fundamentally new way, you're processing it at a deeper level. You're not just reading stuff. That's not a good way to study. Just reading stuff, not a good way to study. It's sort of a prerequisite to moving to the next level, but the next level should be, let me teach you something if you teach me something. Okay, that's one really good way to go. Another good way to go, separate from that, would be to say, how, if I were the professor, what questions would I ask? Right? How would I write a bunch of multiple choice questions based on the lecture I just heard? Okay? So now all of a sudden you're saying, oh, I'm not just thinking about it in the way that it's written, I'm thinking about it and I'm saying, what's sort of the interesting twist here? Right? In the Kelly and Conley study, you can imagine somebody asking about which dimensions of personality matter the most. Right? That's a good question. You should think about writing that question. But as you go through the lectures, again, the starting point for how you think about this material, and then as you start to look through the recognized voluminous extent of the reader, you want to start not just saying, holy cow, there's a lot of stuff here for me to remember, but to say, okay, where are the questions in here? Where would a reasonable, and I hope a reasonable, where would a reasonable professor ask questions? And start thinking about those questions. Start saying, this is the question. Okay, so that's another good way to go. A third strategy that I would suggest to you is try to work toward good outlines of the chapters. Okay? There's one of the perverse things about learning is that I've got stuff in my head, right? I've been doing this for 25, 30 years. Ben Carney, he's got stuff in his head. And when we sit down and we write the book, we write an outline. We sit down and we say, well, there's got to be this part, and then there's got to be this part. And then within this part, there's got to be these three parts. And then within this part, there's got to be these three parts. Okay? That's sort of how, I mean, if you've written a paper, you know, it's not usually a stream of consciousness thing. You really try to organize. You try to impose structure. Your job as a student, oddly enough, is to say, okay, let me throw out all the words and just try to extract the outline back out. Like, what is the structure of the arguments that the professors are trying to tell me in a class like this? This won't be true of all your classes, but in a class like this. And then you want to get to the point where you say, you know what, in this section, I think this was the one important idea. Okay? So now you've got a whole page that's reduced to one or two lines of your notes. Right? And you say, I think this is the thing that stands out. And then you might say, and this could be a question. Right? So you want to start diving in and throwing stuff out that doesn't really help you to understand the material. Right? That it's detail, it's useful detail. We got to put it in there because we're hoping lots of people read this book and they understand it, and we have to add in all these words to generate that understanding. But you just need to pull out the understanding and write that down in your notes, right? So that when you're done, you've got, what are there, 7 chapters in this part of the exam, this part of the class? You know, you've got maybe 2 pages for each chapter, 2 or maybe 3 tops, and it's just got all this stuff in it. Now, you might miss something, and there might be a question in there that you end up missing, but now you've gone to from a bazillion pages down to 15 or 20, okay? And that's the stuff. But what's important is not just that stuff, but the process of your doing that, right? The process of you saying, you know what? I think this is the important idea. And that's what we're really asking you to do, is try to work through separating out the wheat and the chaff. And if you can get 6 other people to do that with you in your group, well, you just did 1 chapter and got 6 ones free with another group of people who are really good at extracting that information, right? So you want to build in some efficiency in the way that you do that. You're much better off trying to do it. Any questions for me? I know that's a lot of stuff. We realize that. But that's some of the ways that having taught this and having written the exams, I would suggest to penetrate this material a little bit. Are there specific questions that I might answer? Okay. All right. Well, today we're going to finish our lecture on individuals in relationships. And you know, I divided that up into 4 sections for you, and each one has a few key points that we want you to know. And I was on the 4th and final theoretical perspective, the 4th and final approach to thinking about diversity within intimate relationships, individual diversity, that is to say. We were talking about attachment theory. I'd already talked about personality traits. I'd already talked about personality dynamics. I'd already talked about the family and intergenerational transmission issues. And I mentioned that there was a subset or another angle on the intergenerational transmission perspective is to think intently about caregiver relationships when we're young and what ensues from those experiences as we go on into our adult relationships. And I further made the distinction between, within attachment theory, between a perspective focused on the universal aspects of attachment, which is to say, that answers the question, why would anyone be in a relationship? How can we understand relationships as a human phenomenon? And then, once we've sort of figured that out, how do you understand individual differences within relationships? You remember that distinction? Okay, let me just take you back through the first part of that a little bit. And here is Mary Ainsworth. And I mentioned to you that we can think about this as kind of like a software program that exists within us, a way that, a capacity that we have that orients us towards other human beings, okay, towards social relationships. And according to attachment theory, the infant orients him or herself toward three things. I think I went through these. What's going on inside of them emotionally, like how aroused they are, how upset they are, whether they're feeling comforted and soothed or not. Whether there's another person in the environment that might somehow respond to those needs. And third, what's going on in the environment itself that might prompt me to have an emotional reaction or that will prompt me to seek the support of somebody else. Okay? So the infant experiences what we call felt security, which, when it is threatened, results in efforts to restore proximity to the caregiver. No surprise, right? If you are a young child and you're out exploring the environment and you hear a scary noise or a scary face shows up at the front door, most of us would retreat into a more secure, safer environment. We're scared. We want to do something about it. We have a built-in capacity to protect ourselves and to take care of ourselves, even if it's very primitive. In fact, it's the very primitive nature of it that makes it so important. And if we are able to access the caregiver, if the caregiver is nearby, we pay attention to those threats and to the caregiver's availability, right? We're sort of tracking where mom is or where dad is and what this scary thing is out in the environment, right? But if the caregiver is not available, if there's no place for us to go, if we're stranded, we deactivate. We disengage and we try to be invisible, right? We try to not make a sound. That's the universal system, right? And so it's this coordinated program. It's a program that sort of coordinates these three aspects of our environment, and it really depends on those experiences that we have within us in relation to the environment that cues us into having a certain sort of emotional reaction in relation to a particular caregiver. These experiences, according to attachment theory, become the basis for emotion regulation. So this is how I regulate my own feelings in the face of threats and in the face of having people who can respond to those threats. And according to this perspective, we develop what are called working models of interpersonal relationships. We develop on the basis of these experiences, repeated, usually not just one experience, but repeated over time. We develop a way of thinking about who we are in relation to other people and who other people are in relation to us, okay? And these working models coordinate our thoughts and our feelings and our behaviors as they pertain to closeness and intimacy with intimate others. By the way, right now, we're mostly talking about infants, caregiver relationships in childhood. And the important idea is that caregivers vary in their degree of responsiveness, right? So now we've moved on to the individual differences part of the model, what I think I referred to in the last class as the idiographic approach. We usually call things that don't have a lot of variability associated with them, that are just the rule, as the nomothetic part. What's the rule? Like the word nomenclature. What's the rule that we use for classifying things into categories? Nomenclature. Now we're talking about idiosyncrasies, the individual, and we call this the idiographic approach. And so we usually think about the working models as being organized along two dimensions in relation to caregiver responsiveness. Okay? One of them is anxiety and self-doubt. Okay? Anxiety and self-doubt is one of the dimensions, and we can be high or low on this dimension. I'll talk about that in a sec. But inconsistent, unavailable caregiver is going to produce anxiety, sensitivity to rejection, low self-worth, and doubts about your own adequacy. Am I worthy? Right? Am I a worthy human being? That's the anxiety, self-doubt dimension. Am I worthy of the care of another person? Right? This is part of the working model, this sort of software program that forms and develops within us that orients us to our own feelings, to others, and to the environment. The other dimension, separate from that, believed to really be separate from that, is the availability of others. So now it's doubt about the other. The first dimension is doubts or uncertainties or not about me and who I am. The second one is my thoughts and feelings about the caregiver, right? What have they got for me, right? And am I going to engage with that person or avoid that person? So here I say, efforts to restore proximity with a punitive or rejecting caregiver. So now if I'm trying to retreat back to this, what I hope will be this safe haven from this scary environment that I've just sort of explored, and I get pushed away, or I get treated badly, that leads me to conclude as an infant that others are best avoided, and that's not a good place for me to go to get my needs met. Right? So this is the core experience that attachment theorists draw attention to. The quality of the caregiving relationship and the availability of a caregiver and the implications that has for who I am and how I feel about my own self-worth and how I feel about the care that I'm receiving and its availability. So, now let's take that into adulthood, okay? This guy named, a woman named Cindy Hazan and Phil Shaver, a very prominent social psychologist, now at UC Davis, they said, oh, this Bowlby guy, he's really got it going on when it comes to thinking about attachment in childhood. This is pretty interesting. Is it possible that we could take that same perspective and think about the working models that are formed in childhood and the continuity of those working models and those two dimensions that I just outlined and say, does that matter in adulthood? Does that help us to organize and understand and make sense of the individuals who are in relationships, which, after all, is what we're trying to accomplish in this part of the course? And they said, well, there's certain similarities between relationships between two adults and relationships between an infant and a caregiver. In good relationships, after all, we're taking care of one another in adulthood, right? Good relationships, and I'll try to get to this later in the lecture today, good relationships are those in which we're reaching out and taking care of somebody else in the hopes that that will come back to us, right? Good relationships involve two people looking out for each other. So, we feel safe when an attachment figure is nearby. Like most of us in a good relationship feel better when our partner is nearby, right? We like having close bodily contact lots of times, right? We share stuff with each other, just like the child goes out into the world and brings it back home and shows something to the mother or the father, the caregiver. We do this with our partners as well. We discover things about the world, we read a book, we make a new friend, we go see a new movie, we discover something about ourselves, we learn something in a new class, and we talk about that with our partner. We share discoveries with one another. Now we're not talking about so much a hierarchical relationship like a mother-child or father-child relationship, but now we have what are likely to be more two equal people, right, in a relationship. So there's mutuality and there's reciprocation now, usually. People are often, like children are pretty fascinated with their parents. Like they look at them and touch their face and try to pull their hair and see what hurts and what doesn't hurt and all that kind of stuff. Lovers do this as well. We're sort of fascinated, especially early on, with the novelty and the unusualness and the smells and the greatness of who our partner is. And some of you, I don't do this, some of you might engage in baby talk with your partner. Now, I was watching a couple in my lab once, and they were about to have a conversation, and they were just sitting there before we told them to start, but we were filming. And the husband said, "Woofu." And she smiled, and I thought, well, that's funny. I've never heard anybody say "woofu" in my lab before. But it was clear, and then one of my students said, "Oh, he's telling her that he loves her. That's how they say they love each other." Okay, so people engage in baby talk. So what we're doing is we're saying there's a way of thinking about intimacy that pervades the nature of the relationship that it resides in, right? That there are characteristics, not all of them, but there are characteristics of our intimate partnerships now, the ones that you have now or might form in the future, and the relationships that you have when you're growing up. And Kim Bartholomew and a guy named Horowitz, Leonard Horowitz, I think his name is, in 1991, they said, well, let's put this all together. I think we can put this together somehow. And here are the two dimensions that I outlined for you a moment ago, which is the positive and negative view of the self. Right? You see that on this dimension. To the extent that you have a positive view of who you are, we'd think of you as being low in anxiety. If you have a negative view of who you are, you'd be high in anxiety. And that starts to sound a lot like negative affectivity, like neuroticism or like low self-esteem. So in some ways, the attachment folks say, you know, that's in there. We got this stuff in our model, that important dimension, but we also add this other dimension. This other dimension is positive view of others and negative view of others. And now we think of that as avoidance. So the individuals have a positive view of others, know that they can turn to their partner in difficult times and know that they're going to be understood and cared for and comforted. But people who, the theory goes, grew up in an environment where the parents were punitive and pushed the child away or not very nice, not very warm and huggy to be around, well, they're going to have a different perspective on what others have in store for them. Right? They have different working models. So this is the idiographic part, right? It's the individual difference part of of our working models, and it's organized along these two dimensions. And it's important to recognize that these are dimensions, not types, okay? But sometimes it's convenient to talk in terms of types because it's easy to sort of get an image in your head of the different typology, the different places within the typology that a given person might be. By the way, I think you can still go to the University of California, Davis psychology website, find Phil Shaver's name in the list of faculty, and go to his website and take a measure that will put your little speck, your dot, in this space. Okay, so you can go figure out your attachment classification. Have any of you done that yet? Okay, you should check that out using using one of the standardized measures. I believe that's still possible. So what I've done is put the labels on, even though we shouldn't really think in terms of typologies. I've put the labels on the four different quadrants within this model, and you see the secure individual has a positive view of themselves and a positive view of other people. Most people in the population are secure, is my understanding of the population-based studies that have been done so far. But there are three kinds of insecure styles. One would be the preoccupied individual who has a positive view of others but a negative view of himself or herself. The dismissing individual who has a positive view of themselves but a negative view of others. Some people think that that is true of Jerry Seinfeld's character in Seinfeld, if you saw that. Like sort of, he thinks pretty highly of himself, but he sort of keeps his distance from other people. And the other individual who has a negative view of themselves and of other people is, of course, George Costanza, and he would be characterized as fearful. Remember, George Costanza was at one point engaged to a woman who was in prison. So, if and when you get you should have these slides, and you will be able, if you have them up in PowerPoint, to click on the links. These are hyperlinks, so you'll be able to click on the links within the slides, and it'll take you to another slide that describes what happens, what the psychology is of these 4 different types of people, even though, of course, they are not real types. So let me just go through one of them, and then you'll have them as well, the other 3 as well. So a fearful individual has a negative view of themselves and of others, so they're high in anxiety, and just like the dismissing individual, they're prone to avoiding intimacy and closeness. Their quest for intimacy begins with the expectation that they're not worthy of others' caring and consideration, and that pushes them to seek validation from others, right? Like, convince me that I'm a good person, right? I need you to validate me because I'm having trouble doing that myself. And I think that's one of the things I'm going to get out of this relationship. At the same time, they struggle with the internalized sense that others are unlikely to provide them with exactly that affirmation, right? So I really, really need this from you, and I really think you're not going to provide that for me. And that's the struggle. Now, do people think these thoughts in their heads? No, this is the working model. And part of what we have to do as scholars, as scientists, is try to figure out ways to quantify this and put labels on people. So the questionnaire that you might complete is one way to try to accomplish that. So it's not necessarily articulated. It's not necessarily verbalized as we go through our daily lives. And because others are expected to be a source of pain and rejection, fearful individuals tend to avoid intimacy and the discomfort that it brings. So here's an individual desperately needing intimacy, but also struggling because the closer they get to somebody, which is something they really need, they also have to pull back with, because they have the belief and really a deep understanding that this individual is not going to provide them what they need. Okay? So the important idea, there's many important ideas of attachment theory, but the important idea is that we possess something called working models, that these are derived from the experiences that we have in caregiver relationships in childhood, and that those working models are oriented toward an evaluation of oneself as a worthy or unworthy individual, which tracks the anxiety dimension I was telling you about earlier. And the second dimension is the worthiness or the trustworthiness of another individual to meet the needs that I have, which tracks the avoidance dimension. Okay? Now it turns out, I don't have a lot of slides about it, in fact, maybe none. It turns out that there are all kinds of interesting correlations between secure and insecure attachment and the quality of our relationship. So there's a lot of evidence that this model provides us useful information, a useful perspective on the kinds of relationships individuals form in relation to these different kinds of dimensions. Okay? Now, I'm not sure if Lisa had a chance to post today's slides. Do you know, did anybody get these slides? Yeah, they did get up. Okay, Lisa, I know, is taking a trip to a conference today. So I'm glad to know you have these slides. What I'd like to do today is a little different from what we've been doing in the past. And that is, I want to show you some video, and I want us to spend a little time talking about it. You'll see a bunch of other slides in today's lecture when you pull up those slides, but they're fairly close to the reader. Okay, so if I don't get to all the slides today, it won't be as though you will have lost a lot of novel information. Okay, I didn't supplement or enrich or expand the slides today with a lot of information that isn't already in the reader. But what I do want to do is show you some video clips, commercial video clips. One is from the movie Sideways, and one is from the movie The Holiday. And because now we're making a shift, we're shifting to a new part of the syllabus, and that is the part where we talk about how people really now we're talking about communicating closeness. How do people, once we've gotten those two people who were attracted to one another, you remember them, and we talked about the shared conversational platform that they were able to create and the proximity that they had to one another and what they found physically attractive in one another. Well, once we've got those two individuals, and once they're starting to figure out stuff about who they are as individuals, right? Who they are and what their personalities are like, what their motives are like, what their family backgrounds were like, right? Once we engage in those sorts of conversations with a partner, which unfold over long spans of time, potentially, but lots of times that does get front-ended in the conversations that we have with people. We have to make sense of what is it within those conversations that feels good and that is likely to get the conversation going. So given that when we left them, they had a shared conversational platform, right? They were enjoying talking to one another. It felt good to do that. Well, we now need to go one step further and say, why is that? What can we see within these conversations? How can we analyze those conversations so that we don't just think in terms of a shared conversational platform, but we think in terms of intimacy process. What is the process? What has to happen when I talk to somebody and they say, wow, that felt good. I felt connected with that person, right? What has to happen? I'm going to use these two clips to illustrate what does have to happen and what doesn't have to happen. And then from there, we're going to say, okay, so you're in this relationship, you sort of have this conversational platform worked out, and as you'll see, we'll all sort of figure out this, we'll talk about the intimacy process that we see developing within these video clips. Then, as time permits, I'll go through the different ways that people maintain their relationship. Okay, then we're sort of in a maintenance mode. Now, I've been married almost 21 years. Has anyone been married even 5 years in this room? 4 years? 3 years? 2 years? Or in a long-term, real, like, serious committed partnership? Same thing. Yeah. So, how long have you been with your partner? Yeah. How many? 7 years. Now, is it as fresh and wonderful every morning as it was when you first started meeting your beloved partner? Tell me how it's changed. Say again? There's nothing really new. You know your partner well. I'm guessing you love your partner with deep down in the bottom of your heart. 7 years, I mean, come on, that's a commitment. You made a commitment. But the fact of the matter is, you get used to your partner. You get used to your partner. So choose well, right? Did I tell you, one of my friends says, choose well, work like hell. That's the rule for a good relationship. You know, your partner wakes up and they've got bad breath, you know. That's just, you know, that you look at their pillowcase and it's like a Civil War bandage or something. You know, it's just your partner. They're just another person. They're your special person, but you get used to them, right? And so we have to figure out ways. We as relationship scientists know that a lot of what's really great about your lives right now is you're circulating amongst a lot of other 20, 22-year-olds who want to just be in great relationships and have the spark and the passion, the excitement. Well, 7 years later, 21 years later, it's a slightly different picture, okay? So we have to think not just about how people get together and how that happens, but how people stay together and maybe why they don't stay together, right? So that's the maintenance issue. And I hate that word. Like, if any of you come up with a better word than maintenance, let me know. I hate that word because it's like you're working on your car, right? It's like, how's the maintenance going? You know, did you change the oil lately? I hate that word, but there's no better word. It sort of captures the idea well. There's probably a better word, but I don't know it. And unfortunately, this is the word that people use. They talk about maintaining the relationship. And so we'll talk about the slides outline 5 different ways of maintaining the relationship. But for now, I want to take us one step back to when you were just meeting your beloved partner 7 years ago. By the way, where did you meet your partner? Through a good friend. Okay, that's a perfect setup for Sideways. How many of you have seen the movie Sideways? Okay, it's R-rated. There's some language in here. So, in fact, I think I've got a good section with the language. And there is a section where Paul Giamatti, this guy, this is his buddy, Thomas, Paul, something. Hang on, I'll tell you. Thomas Hayden Church is his buddy, and he's getting married, and they decide to drive up the coast and stop in at all these vineyards. They meet up with, just by chance, they meet up with Virginia Madsen, who I think is a waitress, and what's that other woman's name? Sandra Oh. And so the clip that I'm going to show you is them at these two guys with these two women at Virginia Madsen's house, okay? A little house out in the country. Paul Giamatti is a struggling writer, and he's working on this novel. And the clip that I'm going to show you is when Thomas Hayden Church is with, what did I say her name was? Virginia O? Can't be her name. Sandra O. I always get her mixed up with Sandra Singlo, and I just can't remember either of them as a result. So these two are really hitting it off. And so Paul Giamatti and Virginia Madsen are talking on the back porch. And what I want you to pay attention to is, are they connecting? Like, are they getting on with one another? And if not, which is the case, what goes wrong? Where is the shared conversational platform not getting created? Okay? And Thomas Hayden Church, he should just have 2 names. I mean, Thomas Church I could remember. They're off having sex in the living room. Okay. So, how's it going so far? Anybody want to weigh in on this? Yeah. Right. Right. Yeah. Okay. And so he's saying a lot about himself through the wine, through this experience, which is interesting. She didn't really pick up on it, right? So he's disclosing, here's who I am, and he says, so what about you? Now, if they were really connecting, she would say, well, hang on, I'd like to talk a little bit more about you and your wine. Tell me more about that. Tell me more about that. Now, is there any chance that what you're talking about is sort of you? And, how does this all come out in your book? Tell me more about you. Instead, she just answers the question. We'll see she's going to answer the question with the same level of depth and the same level of passion, even more passion about wine and what it means to her. And I think it's more really representing the wine rather than herself, which was the case for him. So now we're going to see her talk. I don't know if any of you remember this. This is a great scene. She is now going to talk about what wine means to her, what it means to her. She'll talk about her ex-husband. And then what matters is how Miles responds, okay? By the way, you probably also noticed the moment where she started saying, they were talking about his book, and she said, oh, I've got a paper due, right? Like, I don't really care about your book. Let's talk about me and my paper, right? Then she eventually says, that was sort of a rift in their conversation, but she then later says, well, when can I read your book? And he says, I just so happen to have a copy in my trunk. Okay, 2 men named Miles. 2 hugs at the end, 2 totally different interpersonal conversations. Now, psychologists care about this. And in the time I have remaining today, I want to take you through this. And this is all a prelude to the maintenance of relationships, right? All the other slides and this other chapter are all organized pretty tightly around 5 different kinds of maintenance. Shared activities, social support, sex, forgiveness, and there's one other one I can't remember. We're not going to talk so much about those. Those are really well laid out. I think they're pretty clear. But what I want to talk about is the intimacy process model, because this is a framework for thinking about how our relationships grow deeper or fail to grow deeper, and it also, conveniently enough, seems to work pretty well at helping us to understand how relationships are maintained. The other maintenance issue is capitalization, by the way, building up positive experiences in our relationship. So according to this model, which may well be the most important thing, it's probably the most important thing I have told you in my 5 lectures, and I dare say it's one of the more important things you're going to learn all quarter, is that when we think about the conversations that we have with our intimate partners or intimate partners-to-be, according to this model, the person who is disclosing information, the person who's revealing something about themselves over here, is thinking about a reaction that he or she might receive. And you can think about the first video or the second video and see how that goes. And the idea is that our relationships deepen and grow to the extent that, I need some lights here. It's not going to work. Yeah, let's do this. To the extent that A feels understood, validated, and cared for. Okay? The key experience that happens when we've created a shared platform with another person, as we're getting to know them, find out about their interests, and their occupation, and their tasks, and their goals, and their fears, and their aspirations. The primary thing that we, as individuals who have disclosed something, so Kate Winslet just disclosed a lot about herself in reaction to Jack Black, in effect, having disclosed a lot about himself, right? The question is, to what extent does either of them, let's start with her, to what extent does she feel understood, validated, and cared for, right? Those are the if we think about the attachment perspective as sort of what are the criteria we use, what are the criteria that exist within us for evaluating things? We have these 2 dimensions, the worthiness of the self and the worthiness of the other, the anxiety and the avoidance dimensions. Here we're talking about 3 dimensions along which we evaluate and experience the behavior of an potentially intimate other. To what extent does this person get me, right? Do you understand what I'm talking about? Miles and, in the first video clip, Virginia Madsen, they understood one another. They were talking a lot about wine, right? Did they feel validated? Yeah, there was some validation, but it didn't quite come through, right? It wasn't all the way. He could not respond to her disclosure about wine in a way that let her know that this is a guy who's going to understand her feelings and know what to do with them, right? So and the idea is, it's not just that our conversations lead us and our disclosures lead us to feel understood, but more than being understood, it's being validated, because you can understand somebody without validating who they are, right? You can understand someone who you really don't like, but it doesn't mean you value them. Or you have to go one step further and say, who you are, I like that. It's good. It's a good thing, right? And more than that, what we're doing when we're disclosing is we're conveying the extent to which, when we're responding to a disclosure, we're conveying the extent to which that individual is going to feel cared for in the future, right? So Virginia Madsen, we assume, when they took a shot of her sitting on the back porch and then going to get water, this isn't happening for her, right? This is not happening for her. And she did not feel cared for by Miles. Tell me, doesn't the other movie, The Holiday, end with them getting together? Don't Jack Black and Kate, they get together, right? Those two get together, right? They connect. She made a disclosure, he made a disclosure. Look, I understand you, I value you. You're a decent person, Miles. You're a decent person, and he's self-effacing. Yeah, that's always my problem, right? So he's not saying, yeah, I'm a decent person. He's saying, oh, yeah, but look at what good that did me, right? He's funny. It's rewarding to be with him. And she is starting to collect information that says, does this guy get me? He gets her. Well, crap, you need this vodka more than I need it, right? That's what he says. And then he says, is this the guy who did this? And he did this, so this is what happened, right? And she says, yeah, you understand, you get it, you got it, you figured it out. And you can tell by the way that he's looking at her that he values her. He understands her experience, it matters to him, and she is starting to wonder, is this guy care for me? Not in the sense that, oh, I care for you, but is this person going to really do what it takes to help me understand that if this is the relationship that I'm going to be investing in the future, that my needs are going to be well met? Good relationships, relationships that move from that stage where we're sort of strangers, and now we're not thinking about one-night stands or really, really short-term dating strategies, which are fine, they're a little bit different from this, but we're talking about people who are sort of looking for longer-term connections, longer-term commitments. And it's no surprise that these people are in their, late 20s, early 30s maybe. So that's how relationships move from that conversational platform. And what has to happen, what the experience has to be, one person has to say something. They have to talk about themselves. Relationships, in order to grow, somebody has to reveal something. They can't reveal too much too quickly, right? You don't want to do that. The TMI problem, right? If someone's revealing too much information right out of the gate, you say, wow, this person's really insecure. This person is just unloading on me. And if this person is unloading on me now and I barely know them, well, assuming they're sober, well, what are the chances of me feeling understood, validated, and cared for in this relationship, right? So disclosures get the ball rolling, okay? And both of the clips that I showed you started with disclosures. Okay, so one person discloses things, and it's something about what they want, what they need, what matters to them, what they're afraid of. And then B hears that and says, oh, let me respond. I have a take on that, right? And Miles' take, we don't really know what it is. We know his behavioral response is really clumsy and unskilled, leading her to not feel very good. Virginia Madsen does not feel connected to him. And we have to wonder, what's going on in all this, right? What is the anxiety that he's experiencing? Some of that's going to be individual differences, like we just talked about, right? Maybe it's his attachment history. But for her, she's going to say, well, if I'm going to read into his behavior that he's got some baggage here, then I'm not going to pursue a relationship with a guy where I'm not going to feel understood, validated, and cared for. Okay? So the intimacy process model is very, very powerful because it connects who we are as individuals when we're just getting to know somebody. And it links up these disclosures that we make, statements that we make, and the responses of another interested person to those disclosures. And if this happens repeatedly in a relationship, it grows. And if this doesn't happen, if people when we're in relationships, when we're really thinking about forming a relationship, this is what's on our radar screen. This is what we're tracking. Feeling understood, feeling validated, feeling cared for. I don't know if you have heard of this parable, but it's my favorite parable. And it's the difference between heaven and hell. Any of you heard this? What's the real difference between heaven and hell? Well, if you go to hell, and I hope you never do, if you go to hell, everybody's down there and they've got they're all sitting around this huge bowl of broth, right? And everybody's got these really, really long spoons. Have any of you heard this parable? I'm almost certain. Yeah, someone in the back. Okay. Anybody, you've heard this one? Yeah, good. I thought I made it up, but it doesn't exist on the internet. It doesn't exist on the internet. I could not find a source for it. So I'll claim credit for it. If you go to hell, everybody has these really long spoons and they're trying to feed themselves and they can barely get food on. They've got carrots on their face and chicken broth all down their front and they look terrible and it's all in their hair. If you go to heaven, it's the exact same situation. A bunch of people sitting around a bowl, everybody's got a long spoon, but they're feeding each other. You figure out the system. A good relationship is one in which we take care of somebody else. The hardest thing that we have to do in a relationship is figure out what this other person sitting in front of me needs. And the hardest thing is to take the risk and say, I'm going to feed you. I'm going to nurture you. And I really hope that I get something back in return. Relationships are about taking risks, disclosing things, needing things, and doing so in the hopes that in the course of you taking care of somebody else will take care of you. Intimacy process model, important for understanding how we move from these conversational platforms to deeper, stronger, more committed, well-maintained relationships. So, I will not see you next week, but Professor Carney will be back on Wednesday. Thank you for your attention, and good luck on the exam. Thank you very much.